So there's this huge, kind of hidden industry in America that's built around poverty. It's a wild story, really. It all starts with good intentions, but, well, it leads to some pretty staggering profits and a whole lot of consequences no one saw coming. So today, we're going to follow the money.
Okay, get this. To fight poverty, the US government spends $1 trillion every single year. I mean, that's $1,000 billion. It's an almost unimaginable amount of money, all aimed at helping people meet their most basic needs. But here's the thing. That money doesn't always go where you might think. Which brings us to the big question, right? Who is really profiting from all this? So that's what we're going to do. We're going to follow that trillion-dollar trail and see where it leads. All right, to understand how we even got to this point, we need to look at a huge shift in strategy. See, this whole idea of using private, for-profit companies to deliver social services, it's actually a pretty recent thing. And man, it changed everything.
Just look at this timeline. You can see exactly how much things have changed. You go back to the 60s and President Johnson declares a war on poverty. It's all about direct government aid and, you know what? It actually worked. Poverty rates dropped by 30%. But then, fast forward to the 80s, and the Reagan administration comes in with this whole new idea, privatisation. And by the time we hit the 90s, President Clinton just floors it, accelerating that trend and completely changing how aid gets to people in America.
This really lays it all out, doesn't it? The before and after. On the left, you've got the old system. Super straightforward. Taxpayers to the government to the citizens. A straight line. But now, look at the new system on the right. Suddenly, there's this winding path. You've got for-profit companies wedged right in the middle, acting as middlemen.
Now, the thinking behind this change was on the surface pretty logical. The theory was that private companies, driven by the need to make a profit, would be way more efficient than the government. The whole goal was to cut waste, trim the fat, and make the system better for everybody. At least, that was the theory. So how would that theory work out in the real world? Well, that's where things get complicated. We're about to dive into 6 specific cases that show some of the, let's say, massive loopholes this system created. Okay, let's kick things off with something most of us can relate to, unfortunately, filing taxes. But we're going to look at a very specific part of it, a tax credit that was designed to help low-income families. And you'll see how it's become a huge moneymaker for certain companies. So you've got the Earned Income Tax Credit. It's a super important benefit, but it's buried in our ridiculously complex tax code. And that complexity basically forces people to use tax prep services. Here's the problem, though. Some companies, like Liberty Tax, have faced lawsuits accusing them of using this as a chance to skim money right off the top of refunds or to push people into these really high-interest refund anticipation loans. And you see a really similar pattern when you look at housing. Instead of building public housing, the government now often just gives out vouchers. Think of them like coupons to help pay rent to a private landlord. But this has created its own set of pretty big problems. Just check out these numbers from an investigation in Washington, D.C. You have an apartment that on the open market would rent for $1,600 a month. But if a tenant comes in with a Section 8 voucher, suddenly the price is $2,500. Why? Because the landlord knows the government, with not a lot of oversight, will just pay the inflated price. So the landlord gets rich, and the money that was supposed to help families just vanishes. Okay, so we've talked about individual landlords. Now let's scale way, way up. We're talking about the biggest players in this entire industry. Massive corporations that states hire to manage all sorts of welfare benefits. And just look at this number to get a sense of the scale here. There's a key company called Maximus. Back in 1995, their revenue was about $88 million. Today, it's almost $5 billion. That's not just a company growing, that's an entire industry being built from scratch, just on administering government programs. But this is where you find the core problem. The company's real customer isn't the person who needs help, it's the government agency that gave them the contract. So to make the most profit, their incentive is to cut their own costs, and that often means cutting staff. The results can be just devastating. When Maximus took over Medicaid in Tennessee, there was a 23% spike in uninsured kids. In Kansas, it led to massive backlogs, leaving elderly people waiting for health care. The grim truth is, it's often cheaper for the company to just deny or delay benefits. And this pattern of messed up incentives gets even more disturbing when we get into healthcare. Let's start with Medicaid dentistry. That's the government's dental program for low-income folks. The way they pay dentists has created a deeply troubling situation. See, because Medicaid pays less than private insurance, some clinics basically have to become volume businesses to survive. And this quote, it's from a lawsuit against a big Medicaid dental franchise. It's just shocking. They were accused of doing invasive, totally unnecessary procedures on kids, like root canals on babies, all to maximize their profits. We're talking about the most vulnerable patients you can imagine.
And you see the exact same volume-based incentive structure in another critical part of healthcare, kidney dialysis. This is a life-saving treatment, and it's heavily paid for by the government for people who can't afford it. So the government pays these for-profit centers for every single treatment. It turns it into a numbers game. But here's the kicker. Dialysis is supposed to be a temporary fix, a bridge to getting a kidney transplant. But for a for-profit center, a patient who gets a transplant is a lost customer. And the results are just alarming. Studies have shown these centers have higher patient death rates, and they refer 17% fewer patients for the transplants that could save their lives. And that brings us to our last case. And honestly, this is the one that a lot of people find to be the most outrageous of all. It involves taking federal benefits away from some of the most vulnerable children imaginable, kids in the foster care system. So here's how this works. If a child in foster care is disabled or has lost a parent, they're legally entitled to a monthly Social Security check. But what happens is, states will hire a company, like Maximus again, to find these eligible kids, and then help divert that money, the child's money, into the state's general budget. And for doing this, the company gets a fee. In Alaska, for example, it was $1,600 for every child whose benefits they managed to redirect. Okay, so it's obviously a deeply flawed system. But does that mean it's hopeless? Not necessarily. Experts have actually laid out some pretty clear ways we could fix this, to realign those incentives and stop the worst of the exploitation. So what can we actually do? Well, it really all boils down to accountability. Experts point to a few key things. Stronger government oversight is a big one. Also, breaking up the near monopolies that a few of these huge companies have to create some real competition. And even putting legal caps on how much profit they can make. At the end of the day, the government, which remember is the customer, has to start measuring and demanding better results for the actual human beings these programs are supposed to be helping. But making these changes is not easy. Not at all. Take California, for example. They tried to put a profit cap on those dialysis centers we talked about. The industry's response? They spent over $100 million to defeat that proposal. It just goes to show you the incredible financial power these companies have to protect their bottom line. And all of this, really, leaves us with a fundamental ethical question. When we decide to turn social services into a for-profit business, we have to ask ourselves, where is the line? Where does efficiency stop and exploitation begin? How much profit is okay when the product you're selling is supposed to be a solution to human suffering?